Bonjour, film fans. Imagine you've just got some terrible news, some life-altering news. It might not be from the most reputable source, but it's a source that you give a lot of credence to. But you're in limbo. That news is going to be confirmed in just a couple short hours. I'm talking life and death here. What do you do? How do you spend those 2 hours waiting to find out what your future is? Well, these are the questions and in some ways the answers posed by the 1962 film Cléo from 5 to 7, the subject of this episode of What Makes This Film Great. Hi film fans, just a quick reminder that I'm now on Patreon, where I'm adding lots of new content all the time. If you like what I've been doing here and you've been watching these vids for a while, why don't you head on over there and drop me a dime. Link in the description. Hey everybody, I am on vacation or on holiday, thus the different surroundings. I'm actually visiting my sister right now in my home state of Maine, and I'll be here for a couple more days. There might be one more video I do from this location. The lighting's not the best, the sound's not the best. I forgot my microphones at home, but I wanted to get another video up, so here we go. As I said, Cléo from 5 to 7, or Cléo de 5 à 7, is a 1962 film. It's directed by Agnès Varda, with a script by Varda, and it features the work of at least 3 named cinematographers: Jean Rabier, Alain Levent, and Paul Bonny, and it was edited by Pascal Lavonier and Janine Verneau. Varda is often considered a left bank filmmaker, and I'm not going to go into the intricacies of this, but any of you who are sort of French film historians or French film experts, if you want to get into it in the comments, that would be fantastic. Generally, as the new wave was kicking off, the film directors who had the most success, or the filmmakers whom history has deemed the kind of foundational core of the new wave, were those filmmakers who were associated with the magazine Cahiers du Cinéma, and many of them had written for Cahiers du Cinéma. So you get people like François Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, Claude Chabrol, Rivette, Romer, and these are the filmmakers who had started their careers often as film critics, and one of their sort of great legacies, or let's say complicated legacies, was the early iterations and the early spelling out of what would become the auteur theory. However, they were not the only young, vibrant filmmakers in Paris at the time. There was another group of filmmakers who was friendly. This wasn't like two camps, like Yankees versus Red Sox or Man United versus Liverpool. They were friends with each other, they worked with each other and so on, but there was another group that was called the left bank filmmakers, and Varda was one of them. So was Chris Marker, Alain Resnais, and Jacques Demy, and some others. And anytime we make these sort of binary definitions, you can break them down, but the left bank filmmakers are often considered less kind of film-centric, which can sound paradoxical, but they were coming from a sort of arts background. So Varda herself was originally a photographer, and you can see that in her filmmaking. So whereas the new wave proper gang were often considered like rabid, crazy, wonderful, ecstatic film fans, the left bank filmmakers are often considered practitioners of film as an art in association with the other visual arts, including photography, theater, and also to an extent literature. And that's the tradition that Varda is coming out of. Cléo is actually Varda's second film. She'd made a film in 1955 called Le Point Court. Again, as I'll say throughout this series, pardon my French. And that's considered an important sort of progenitor of the French New Wave. As I said in my video on Ascenseur pour l'échafaud, the New Wave didn't just start with the 500 Blows or something like that. It was developing throughout the 50s, and Varda was part of that. And if you read sort of French New Wave film history from the 70s, 80s, 90s, it's often written about mainly those cahiers filmmakers who I talked about, Godard, Truffaut, Chabrol, etc. But recent history and recent film analysis is doing a lot of work exploring the roots of the French New Wave and articulating the reasons why it's not just those filmmakers, and that they were actually borrowing from people like Louis Malle or Jean-Pierre Melville and Agnès Varda, who, you know, Roger Ebert calls the soul of the French New Wave. So she had made a film in 55, but Cléo from 5 to 7 is often considered her sort of first masterwork. It stars Corinne Marchand as Cléo, or Florence, which I think is interesting because that's the same name as our heroine from Un ceinture pour l'échafaud. Both films feature extended sequences of these women walking the streets of Paris, long takes walking through Paris. In the case of Un ceinture, or Elevator to the Gallows, it's mainly at night, often in the rain. Whereas in Cléo, it is from 5 to 7 in the evening, but it's still, for the most part, light outside. So you get a different vibe, but there's a similarity there. And I think there has to be some intentionality to the naming of Cléo. Throughout most of the film, she's known as Cléo, but at the end we find out her name is Florence. Another important character in the film is Antoine, and he's played by Antoine Boursellier, and I'll come back to him later. He shows up for about the last 20 minutes of the film, but it's an incredibly important appearance for, I don't know, the delivery or the cementing of the film's kind of deeper themes about life and death, reality. How does one live life to the fullest when one knows that we are mortal and that death could be around the corner or at a certain time on the clock? The film's story is fairly simple. In the opening minutes, Cléo is visiting a fortune teller. She's having her tarot cards read, and the fortune teller tells her many things, but the main thing is, you have cancer and it doesn't look good. And it's an interesting way to open the film, and I'll come back to the visuals of the opening in a moment. But having the news delivered by a tarot reader is an interesting decision on the part of Varda, because it immediately throws the news into question. How reputable is this source? How much should Cléo believe this news? We see throughout the film that Cléo is incredibly superstitious. She worries about dark omens. She's in a dark mood anyway, so she's looking for kind of reinforcement of that mood. But she is superstitious, so when things happen like the breaking of a mirror, she fears what that might mean. So while some of us might watch a tarot reading and go, oh, that's fun. Wow, that's a dark reading. What you gonna do? For Cléo, it's something to take seriously. But as we soon discover, it's not just the fortune teller's news. Cléo is waiting for news from her doctor. She's at the fortune teller at 5 p.m. and she's meant to phone her doctor at 7, at which time he's going to give her the result of a test, presumably a biopsy, and tell her whether or not she has cancer. So the fortune teller is, at least to a certain extent, right. We don't know for sure throughout most of the film's runtime whether Cléo has cancer, but we know that it's a distinct possibility. And so the film, it's often described as real time, it's not quite real time. It's a 2-hour time span from 5 to 7, as the title says, and it's a 90-minute film. So there are some elisions and some cuts that sort of compress those 2 hours into 90 minutes, but it's very close to real time. And so what we are going to do over the course of this film is spend 2 hours with Cléo as she roams the streets of Paris, as she visits friends, and as she goes back to her apartment, meets some other friends, and changes clothes, leaves her apartment, roams around some more. We see her walking a lot, but we also see her taking taxis. We see her with her friend driving around in a car, and if you drive The scenes of driving in Paris in the early 60s, we get a bit of it in an Elevator to the Gallows, but in Cleo, man, I'm surprised not everybody was crashing all the time. Um, we see her take a trolley or a sort of tram. I don't think those are in Paris anymore. Um, and so we get to see a lot of Paris as she goes about her day. Cleo is a burgeoning pop star. We find out over the course of the film that she's got about 3 or 4 songs that have been released. She has some fans, but they don't always recognize her. For example, she goes into a hat shop at one point. She's looking around the hats. She's with her assistant, sometimes described as a maid, but she seems almost as much a kind of a manager or a handler as she is a maid. She tells Cleo what to do a lot. Or she's very free with her opinion in a way that a maid, at least as they're depicted on film usually, I don't think would be. But she goes into this hat shop, and the sales clerk doesn't recognize her. But once the sales clerk hears her name, she's like, "Wow, I love you. You're one of my favorite singers. Can I have your autograph?" So that's about her kind of level of fame or success at this point. That people are familiar with her name, they know some of her songs, but she's not kind of a phenomenon yet. And that's an important part of the film, because Cleo, she never kind of states it, but she wants fame. She wants to be looked at, and how one is looked at and how one looks at oneself and how one looks at others is an important part of the film. It's an important part of the film's theme. It's an important part of the film's mise en scène. It's an important part of the film's feminism, and it's often described as one of the great early feminist films in the way it depicts a female gaze, that rare film kind of before the 70s or 80s even, that consciously tries to display its hero or heroine's life through her perception, through her understanding of how she feels about the world and how she thinks the world feels about her. And this is one of the fascinating things about this film, is the effort that it puts into framing the narrative in that way through this female or woman's perception, but at the same time, how effortless it seems as it does so. Let's talk a little bit about how this film works. Everything that works about this film, and there's a lot that works about this film, is kicked off in the opening credits sequence, which is Cleo at the fortune teller's having her tarot cards read. And there's a few things to say about this. There's a lot going on here, and I should say there's a lot going on in this film. It's visually packed with information, and occasionally I get comments below like, "I'm surprised you didn't talk about XYZ." With Cleo from 5 to 7, you cannot talk about XYZ. I'm barely going to get past A, or, A minus, or whatever it is. So apologies if I don't get to your favorite part. I probably won't. But back to the opening credits. A few things to point out. First of all, look how it's shot.
Coupé, mademoiselle. Et choisissez 9 cartes de la main gauche.
Je sais. 3 pour le passé, 3 pour le présent, 3 pour l'avenir.
Vous connaissez les tarots?
Un peu comme ça.
That is like Wes Anderson and Robert Yeoman's aesthetic right there. For Varda, it's just the opening credits sequence. I love it. It's an amazing sequence. But there's a couple other things going on here. The first one is this amazing cut and then intercutting from color, the color of the opening shot, to black and white. Now, we might ask why the filmmakers make this choice. And the remainder of the film is in black and white. But why this change? And there could be many reasons for it. First of all, the early New Wave filmmakers were just experimenting with the effect of non-traditional filmmaking. Jump cuts and jumping over the 180-degree line, which Varda does in this film, both of those things. Non-linear storytelling, and so on. So they were interested in an artistic sense in just kind of pushing the envelope of what film was supposed to do. Like, why not cut from color to black and white? Why not jump the 180-degree line? We can do those things. But also, I think there's two other things to consider here. One is that Cléo goes into this reading, into this sort of fortune teller's very colorful domicile, and these cards are very colorful, and she gets a reading of death. She gets a reading of at least Cancer. She actually gets the death card at one point, and the tarot reader, as all tarot readers will do, tells her, oh, the death card doesn't mean death. It means a significant or dramatic change. But still, Cleo's already got the potential of Cancer on her mind, and she gets the death card. Anyhow, we see all these colorful cards, we see this colorful mise-en-scène, and then she gets this reading of Cancer, and the color is drained from her life. The color is drained from her experience. And that's one reason we could say it goes from color to black and white. Another is that much of what's going on in this film, one of the things that makes it great and immensely rewatchable is the subtle disorientating effects of the filmmaking. Cléo is rudderless for the duration of this film, or for much of the film. She doesn't know what's going on. She doesn't know how she feels. We get snippets of voiceover here and there where she's questioning herself. She's questioning her beliefs. This potential of Cancer for her has unmoored her, and she is disorientated herself. And the film style and the film form is going to replicate that in a lot of interesting ways. And it does it in two ways in this opening title sequence. The first is the switch from color to black and white. And the second one I really love is the use of the cards. So the fortune teller starts telling Cléo her fortune, and she describes the cards as tarot. But as we look at them first, they look very similar to a nice or fancy or old-fashioned, but a type of playing cards. And then she says, oh, this reading's no good. We have to do another reading. And she starts to flip the cards. And now they're tarot cards. And this is also a very subtle but disorientating effect. And if you look closely, you can see there are two decks of cards, and the backs of the cards are very similarly designed. So this leads me to believe that this was intentional, right? So that we all we see when we're looking at the table is decks of cards with this very tiny kind of checked design or pattern. And so when she's flipping playing cards and then flipping tarot cards, it seems like the deck has somehow changed. But if you look closely, they're two different decks. But that adds to the disorientating effect. So Cléo is sitting there, and this tarot reader's telling her, oh my God, you've got Cancer, right? I want to end this reading. Cleo's like, read my hand. And she's like, I don't read hands, no. She's disorientated. Cléo's disorientated. We're disorientated by the film's choice in that opening sequence. The film is going to continue to push this disorientating approach to style and narrative, sometimes in very obvious ways, sometimes in very subtle ways. For example, a very obvious one is when she leaves the fortune tellers and she's walking down the stairs of the apartment. So you see there, the cuts are quite interesting. We get shots of Cléo herself coming down the stairs. These are quite typical shots. And then it jumps to point of view shots. So we see, and there's a sort of shaky handheld camera here, and we're seeing what Cleo sees, but they're slightly disorientating. But then we get those repeat shots of Cleo coming down the same step, the same step, the same step. And those are more obviously disorientating. And the film's going to do things like that throughout with jump cuts and so on. But it also does it more subtly. For example, she goes to a couple of different cafes, and in this one instance, she's listening to another conversation.
Il est condamné. Sa femme prend un air de veuve. Puis il se fâche, se lève du lit tout fiévreux, demande du café et sa besace. Il veut s'en aller. Il fait le tour de sa chambre et dit...
La chambre, tu la loues ou quoi?
J'ai un peu sommeil, mais demain je partirai.
Tu es tout de même chez toi, oui ou non?
La famille est affolée. Tu comprends pas. On en va chercher les
pourtant
parents,
simple.
les oncles, les
J'en ai
cousins.
assez de partir de chez toi à 2h du matin.
Il en profite pour les saluer.
Moi, je suis
avant son
crevé le
départ.
lendemain, j'ai sommeil, je suis mort.
Il ne veut absolument pas entendre...
Much like this one, a lot of the conversations we're going to hear and that Cleo is going to hear throughout the film are conversations between men and women in some state of relationship. In this one, the man's trying to convince the woman to let him stay overnight in her place all night. And she's, you can't because my landlord doesn't like that, and so on. But what I love about it is the way the shot first begins with that mirror, and mirrors are very important throughout the film. So that there's the off-screen voiceover and there's the mirror shot, and it's quite difficult at first to know who's having this conversation. It takes just a second to get our bearings there. And this one is less obvious than the staircase, or even I think than the tarot readings at the beginning, because it's not directly associated with Cleo. So we're watching her watch them or listen to them. So we're kind of paying attention to her. Maybe the first time you watch this, you don't notice it. Wait, what's happening? And before you have a chance to get confused, we're clearly in the scene and we're grounded in the geography of the space. But it takes a second to get there. And the film does this throughout. And I can't talk about all of them because there's so many. But this is an important part of trying to replicate Cleo's experience of these 2 hours, that we are with her, we're in her space, and everything we see and everything we experience is from her point of view, her gaze, her experience. It's within the context of Cleo and these 2 hours. One other decision that the film makes, and this is a very important one, although it might seem superficial at first, is that it's divided into chapters. Most of the chapters have names, but all of the chapters have a time marker on them, and we see them. And there's some interesting stylistic decisions where sometimes the chapter marker comes at the beginning of a new sequence. Sometimes it comes sort of in the middle of the sequence when we get to like that sequence's mini inciting incident, right? And then all of a sudden a chapter heading comes up and we're like, oh yeah, this is a new chapter. So how and when they're deployed is quite interesting, but the effect that it has, it's different from the disruptions and the disorientating effects of some of the stylistic choices. In this case, the effect that it has is as this constant tense reminder of Cleo's march towards that phone call, that march towards her encounter with the doctor, where she's going to find out whether she has cancer or not. And it's very effective in that way because it's constantly reminding us, the viewer, as well. So we remain in this state of tension with Cleo. I mentioned mirrors earlier, and I talked about gaze quite a bit. There are mirrors throughout the film, and this is very intentionally done. And Cleo looks in the mirror throughout the film. And you really have to kind of think about this for a minute. Like, she might be getting the news that she has cancer. I mean, the fortune teller's already told her she has cancer, and she might be getting that news from the doctor. She is wondering about life, about the meaning of her life, about like the possibility of impending death. She's young, she's vibrant, she's beautiful. She has friends all throughout Paris. Her career is just on the rise. You know, she's looking forward to success, to friendship, to love, to emotional connections. She'll talk about this later. All of these things she wants, and yet she might not get. And so she's often looking at herself in the mirror, and sometimes it can seem vain. You know, she goes into the hat shop and she's trying things on. She's checking her appearance and so on. But oftentimes it's very clearly an inner gaze. She's looking at herself. She's asking herself, who am I? What is this? Like Yoda, what is this flesh? She's wondering what it all means. And so if you've ever had this experience where you're at a turning point in your life, it could be good news or bad news, but you kind of just check with yourself. Yeah. And this is what Cleo's doing. She's checking with herself throughout the film. But she's also aware of other people looking at her. But because she's very self-aware, she's also aware that her awareness of other people looking at her might be overstated. So I want to show a few clips in conjunction with each other. And these are 3 scenes, 2 of them are kind of back to back, of her on the streets in Paris. And early on in the film, she's dressed in this white dress. She's wearing a wig, actually, and she's very light. And this is how she is at the tarot reading, as we've seen. This is how she is walking down the stairs. This is how she is listening to the couple. And later she's going to change into black, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But here's a quick scene of her walking down the street.
Vous arrêtez pas pour regarder nos robes? C'est la semaine de la robe d'été. Si on nous laisse.
So you see, people do look at her. People are interested in who she is. As I've said, she's not famous enough yet for most of them to know, ooh, that's Cleo, the singer. But she's a young, beautiful woman on the streets of Paris. In fact, in several instances in the film, men just come up to her on the street and proposition her, and she blows them off. She doesn't want that kind of attention. Later, she's going to change into black, and that's a very important moment, and I'll come back to it in a moment. But she changes into black, and then she goes back out onto the streets again for a little while, wearing the hat that she bought in the hat shop, which is not a summer hat. And it's very interesting. Have a look at this. Why is no one on the street? Why is no one watching her? This is within the same 2-hour time frame. And all of a sudden, the eyes are gone, but they actually slowly start to return. And it's as if when she walks out in the black dress, she's a different person, and it takes people time to reorientate their gaze to her. But in that time, she walks up to a Chinese restaurant with mirrors on the outside, and we get this moment.
Cette figure de poupée, toujours la même. Et ce chapeau ridicule. Je ne peux même pas lire ma propre peur. Depuis toujours, je pense que tout le monde me regarde et moi, je ne regarde personne que moi. C'est lassant.
I love that scene because it's very self-aware. Like, one could think of Cleo and her musings about, oh, I'm gonna die, oh, life has no meaning, oh, the mirror is broken, it's bad luck, and think, this is kind of a naive young woman who doesn't really understand what she's dealing with, but she clearly understands what she's dealing with. She's very self-aware. She's investigating herself throughout this film. She's investigating what she wouldn't have called it then probably, but what the gaze of others means to her and what the gaze of herself means to her. And without a fairly deep level of self-awareness, she wouldn't make that next step to, oh, they're not all looking at me, I'm only looking at myself, which she's doing as she thinks this. And yet they are all looking at her. And one more example of that is soon after this, she goes to meet a friend of hers, one of my favorite characters in the movie, who's a model in a sculpting workshop. She's a nude model. And we get a short scene of several sculptors, mostly men, sculpting her as Cleo walks into the workshop to meet with her friend. so much I love that's going on in the scene. Firstly, that it's mostly men, that there's a nude woman standing in the middle of these men trying to create her, shape her. There are a couple of women there as well. But then as Cleo walks through, we get those moments of the gaze of the sculptors changing, and the camera's very conscious about this. We don't see Cleo walk past and the back of the person's head, looking at the model, turning. We get that direct engagement with the camera from Cleo's point of view again, and these point of view shots return throughout. And so we see very clearly, not that they're like, oh, there's someone here, but that they are looking, they are gazing at Cleo. So the complicated relationship between her understanding of herself, her understanding of her place in the world, her position in the world, her understanding of how others respond to or expect from her is a lot of what the movie is about. It's a lot of what the themes of the film are about. How does she exist in this world as Cleo? I mentioned that she changes from white to black, and this comes during a very long, extended sequence in the middle or near the end of the first third of the film, when Cleo and her assistant return to her flat, and her flat is like sort of beautifully, sparsely but beautifully designed. There's a swing in the middle of it. I love it. And her songwriters, her sort of composer, pianist composer, and lyricists are going to show up and work on some songs with her. Incidentally, Bob, the pianist, is played by Michel Legrand, who is a French composer. He was the composer of the film, and he plays her composer as well. And she's unhappy with this process. This was an appointment. This was predetermined before she went to the fortune teller, and these guys show up. They seem to know her very well. It's implied that she's had a long relationship with Bob, the piano player composer, perhaps romantic at one point, perhaps occasionally still romantic, although she has another lover that we've met briefly. And she's looking to take the next step in her songwriting career, and these guys are in a silly mood. They have a few drinks, nothing like brain shattering. They have a few drinks, but they're in a silly mood and they're playful, and it's kind of implied that she is often like that too, but now she has the weight of a potential cancer diagnosis on her, and she's not feeling playful, and she's not feeling the music, the songs that they are suggesting to her. And even at one point when she starts to take part in one of the songs they suggest,
c'est trop. Je ne peux plus. C'est affreux.
Mais qu'est-ce qu'elle a?
Elle est fatiguée. Et puis vous savez, le mot cafard est maléfique. C'est comme le mot corde.
Un mot, ce n'est rien, encore que la rime. Mais c'est une belle chanson, je vous assure. Avec ce cri d'amour, vous allez révolutionner le monde de la chanson.
Vraiment? Mais qu'est-ce que c'est qu'une chanson? Combien de temps dure-t-elle?
Allez, caprice.
Caprice, caprice. Vous n'avez que ce mot-là à la bouche. Mais c'est vous qui faites de moi une capricieuse. Tantôt je suis une idiote, une incapable, une poupée de son.
it ends with her feeling dissatisfied again. And finally, what the conclusion that she comes to is that they're not taking her seriously. They're not taking her seriously as an artist, and they're not taking the fact that she's concerned about her health seriously. And she states openly,
Tout le monde me gâte. Personne ne m'aime. Personne.
Dans quel état elle se met?
Je me mets en noir. Pour vos chansons, je serai dans la note.
so she consciously dresses in black to take on this more somber appearance. We're told over and over again that it's summer. Eventually we find out that it's actually the 21st of June, so the first day of summer. And throughout, there's commentary about how she should dress for summer from her assistant and so on. The hat she buys is not for summer. And she makes this conscious decision to dress in black, which is a very, well, these days, who knows, black's so cool, but it seems very unsummery in the context of the film. And that's how she's going to remain dressed throughout the rest of the film. One of my favorite sequences in the film is when Cleo spends several minutes of the day with her model friend, Dorte. And Dorte is played by Dorte Blanc, and they seem to have a long-standing relationship, and Dorte says something about, well, you're starting to get famous and we don't see each other enough. But they have a very playful relationship. And Dorte is the only person in the film known to Cleo, this will change at the very end, but the only person known to Cleo who seems to take her illness or her impending illness seriously. And so their friendship is very lovely, and there's a couple of great moments in here. First of all, Dorte has to deliver something to her boyfriend, or one of her boyfriends, who's a projectionist at the cinema, and she's got some film reels and she drops them off, and they go up into the projectionist booth, and he says, oh, I've got a short to show you. And this is a lovely short, also directed by Varda, with Jean-Luc Godard and Anna Karenina and some other sort of French New Wave people. And it's a wonderful little short, I think you can find it on YouTube, that actually mirrors the story of Cleo. And there's these images of the woman dressed in white and the woman dressed in black. And the whole thing hinges on Godard, the character Godard, the lover in the short, his wearing of sunglasses and removal of sunglasses. And it seems very pointed and very kind of on the nose. But the idea is that life is how you look at it. So as he's looking through his sunglasses, he sees this tragedy unfold. His lover goes down the stairs and she dies, or she's at least seriously injured, and the ambulance comes, and then he takes his glasses off and kind of watches the whole thing again, and that's not at all what happens. And it's a wonderful little short, and they have fun with it, and it's a great part of this film. One of my favorite parts is when Cleo says goodbye to Dorte. So they've been driving in a car. Dorte's been driving again. I don't know how she doesn't crash. And she leaves the car at the cinema, and they hop into a taxi, and they continue to have their conversation about love, about sexual relationships. It's a wonderful friendship, clearly. And then Dorte gets out of the car, and this is a short moment, but to me, this moment encapsulates some of the freedom, the stylistic freedom of the French New Wave.
Merci, Cléo. Tiens-moi au courant.
Au revoir.
Doucement, s'il vous plaît.
Et maintenant?
Tout droit.
It's very simple. She's going up the stairs, the car's moving along, but there's something about the angle, the way she runs up the stairs, the way her dress sort of poofs out. And oftentimes when we think of the freedom of French New Wave, we see the race across the bridge from Jules and Jim, or we see the dance scene and Band Apart. But this, and those are much longer and more choreographed and more exuberant, but this little scene, and you can see Varda's composition here and her understanding of the geographic lines, because as the car moves one way and as Dorte moves another way at an angle, it just feels like an opening. It feels like Dorte is, full of life, full of vim, full of hope. And we'll come back to that, or at least let's say promise, and we'll come back to that in a moment. The film takes a major turn after Dorte's departure, and that is that Dorte has recommended to Cleo that she visit a nearby park. And so she does. She goes to the park, and as she's walking through the park, the sort of trappings of civilization disappear, and there's a small wood or a small forest or cluster of trees in the park, and as she walks towards them, the film momentarily takes on a more kind of natural feel, a more sort of romantic, picturesque feel. And this is where she meets Antoine. Antoine is a soldier fighting in Algiers who's on leave. And throughout the film, there are, as in Elevator to the Gallows, there are moments of reference to the war in Algiers. In fact, in this film, they're more pointed. And finally, Cleo meets this man. And I think through today's eyes, he might appear somewhat sort of pushy and aggressive. We're made to understand that he's lonely, that his leave ends, that he hasn't really met anyone or any of his friends, and all he wanted was some sort of human companionship. Obviously, he's enamored of Cleo, or Florence, as he starts to call her once he finds out that's her real name. And he's a little bit aggressive, but I think in the context of the early 60s, he's, not to excuse it or anything like that, but he's the typical French lover, you know, and he sees a beautiful woman. I'm sorry. He sees a beautiful woman and he realizes I have to talk to her. I have to, make her smile. These things that today we find questionable, but at the time were considered fairly typical. But the important thing is that it works. And he meets Cleo, and at first she's quite resistant. She's like, I'm here to be alone.
C'est calme ici, vous ne trouvez pas?
Oui, je trouve.
Tous les enfants ont disparu.
Quoi disparu?
Les autres jours, c'est plein d'enfants.
Et alors aujourd'hui?
Ah, aujourd'hui, ils sont tous à l'autre bout, à cause des travaux de la pièce d'eau. Ils sont tous allés voir.
Pourtant, de l'eau qui coule, il y en a ici.
Eh oui, l'actualité, c'est bien plus rigolo.
Ce qui est rigolo, c'est que vous soyez au courant.
Je suis curieux.
Alors pourquoi vous n'allez pas voir?
Ah.
And you can see in her body language, she walks away from him. She doesn't want to touch him. And it's at this point where you might be like, dude, get the picture. Walk away. She doesn't want you. But Antoine persists. And eventually she warms up and she tells him about the phone call she has to make. At this point, we're at about 6:15 in the evening, and she's got 45 minutes before she has to call the doctor. She tells Antoine about this, and he says, let's go see the doctor. And she says, I don't want to do this. I don't want to get this news face to face. And he says, I'll come with you. You would do that? I will. I'll make a deal with you. I'll come with you to the doctor, and then you come with me to the train station, because he's shipping out again. And so they spend the remainder of the film together, and they walk out of the park, they walk through Paris, they get onto the trolley, they have these great conversations about what is love, emotional closeness, and hanging over both of them is the possibility of death. And I think for Cleo, and she never states this, but for Cleo, there's a freedom here, because Antoine, even though he's unknown to her before they meet, is the first person who maybe really understands what she's been going through. And an interesting part about this section of the film, this closing of the film, is that there are no more mirrors. And that there's very little, not none, but very little depiction of people gazing at her, because her experience and her perception of the world has shifted. She has found an emotional connection with this man, however short-lived it might be, which allows her to kind of move out or move away from, or momentarily sort of cast off the dread that has been sitting on her shoulders for the last hour and a half. I'm going to spoil the ending here, so if you don't want to spoiler, jump ahead to this point where I wrap everything up. It's just going to be brief. Here it comes. So they go to the hospital. There's some bureaucracy. Antoine insists that they try to find the doctor, but they can't find the doctor. And so they leave, but he pulls up and he very nonchalantly, in this almost breezy way.
Elle aura un traitement un peu fatigant, mais je pense qu'après 2 mois de rayon, tout ira bien. Elle vous tiendra au courant, mais vous pouvez m'écrire si vous le désirez. À demain, mademoiselle. Venez vers 11h, je vous indiquerai la marche à suivre.
This is how she learns, yeah, you have cancer. But the doctor's like, hey, don't worry about it. You're going to be fine. And then he drives off. And so all of this tension that has built up throughout the film, with Cleo self-examining herself, with the time stamps of the chapters, with her constant self-analysis as she looks into the mirror, her constant self-analysis as she thinks about herself, is sort of blown away in this moment, in this like breezy sort of, yeah, you got cancer, but we're going to take care of it. Don't worry about it. See ya. Go, get in touch with the office. And then it's over. But there's a lightness to her. And she says,
Il me semble que je n'ai plus peur. Et il me semble que je suis heureuse.
and this is wonderful. And then we get this great moment, this ending moment where she and Antoine, they've agreed that they're going to stay in touch if he survives Algeria. And then they turn and they face each other. And this is how the film ends. They don't kiss. There's the promise of a kiss. There's the expectation of a kiss, but there's no kiss. And I love this for two reasons. First of all, it sort of counters the typical Hollywood ending. Oh, we only need like 3 more seconds. It's not a time thing. They're there. They're right there. Do it. No, we're not going to do it. But there is the promise. And that's very important. And I think as I was watching this again this week and kind of thinking about that ending, it's not hopeful. I don't think it is necessarily hopeful because we know she still has cancer and we know he's going off to Algeria. It's not necessarily hopeful, but there's potential. There's promise. And I think I like that word better to describe the ending, that it ends on a note of promise, not necessarily a note of hope, or it ends on a note of potential. I'm still working on this and deciding which one I like better, but that's what we're left with. There's a potential future here. That's all the movie's going to give us. It's not going to sort of wipe away her cancer after all this experience we've had with her, all this time we've spent with her. It's not going to just end the war in Algiers. It's not going to just have, someone run off stage and tell Antoine, hey, you've been dismissed from the military. It's not that movie. But there's potential. There is a future, right? There's some sort of future. Take off the sunglasses and see what the future might hold for you. And this makes me love this ending a little bit more every time I watch it. Everybody, this is a wonderful film. It's really like if you're a French film person, if you're a burgeoning French film person, you must watch Cléo from 5 to 7. It's a must-see. It's one of the foundational texts of modern French cinema. It's one of the foundational texts of feminist cinema, and it's one of the foundational texts of Agnès Varda cinema. And Agnès Varda is one of the giants of the film history. So do yourself a favor and watch this film. It's easy to watch, it's easy to follow, it's beautifully shot, beautifully composed, fun, playful, and underneath all of that, there's this very serious contemplation of the meaning of life. And who doesn't need a little bit of that every once in a while to remind us to find our own promise. Thanks for watching, everybody. This is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter. If you've made it this far, as I always ask, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe button. Check out my Patreon page, if you want to cha-ching me a little bit. Help me out as I continue to make these videos. We've got more French Spring coming up. There's going to be a Break the Scene of a very famous scene from the French New Wave coming soon, but I'll also start to look at some French films and what makes this film great from slightly later into the 60s, 70s, and even later. We're not going to stay in the New Wave era. So look for those. They're coming soon. Thanks for watching, everybody. My name's Aaron Hunter. Keep watching movies.